The water, Rawat Kadash. The water, Kai. Thank you, Holy Spirit. All praises to IKAR. That's all praises to Anokeesed. That's all praises to the great I Am loving kindness. Bahashem Yeshaya. Bahashem Matzah, the Lamb. In the name of the Messiah, the Hamashiach. Shalom, family. This is little son Sabal, Nabaya. So, family, we did a lesson not too long ago entitled Ears to Hear, Part 1, The Vision. And we studied how it was that Enoch divided the earth. We also saw how Enoch was given the secrets of the times. He helped to establish the division of time. He was able to establish years and months and weeks and days. Then, family, we did a lesson entitled Enoch's Calendar, the secret of the times revealed, the calendar explained. And we went into the calendar and we got an understanding of the calendar. We got an understanding of how to get our year on the right track, how to ascertain the first day of the year, and then move on, and how to end the year in the correct manner. So, family, what we did was, in searching the ancient paths, the old ways, we went back to establish the original calendar. Now, if you are going to establish the original calendar, especially for the purpose of keeping the holy days, then don't you want to make sure that you're keeping the original holy days? When it comes to the holy days, a lot of the groups out there, they go directly to the Bible, as they should, because there's a saying out there. It says, you have to crawl before you walk. Now, there are some exceptions to that. Some people just get up and start walking, but you understand the point. Most people require training wheels. You see, we all understood from the beginning that these things were a shadow of things to come. How many of you know that when you follow a shadow, it'll lead you to the direction of the light? You see, family, it is one level of discipline to be able to keep the holy days the way we have been keeping them. But when you ask the Father to be closer to Him, when you ask the Father to reveal mysteries unto you, when you ask the Father to be a vessel that is meet for His use, then you also have to understand that to whom much is given, much is required. When you get ancient knowledge, then you have to start walking in the ancient paths. This isn't always the popular road. So today, family, we are going to be going over the ancient holy days. Now, we are not going to go into all of the explicit details for each and every holy day. At some point in the future, we will do that. But for right now, I just want to show you when, how, and why to keep these holy days. Let us begin, like always, in Isaiah chapter 28. That's Isaiah chapter 28, verses 9 and 10. It says, "Whom shall he teach knowledge? And whom shall he make to understand doctrine? them that are weaned from the milk, and drawn from the breast. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little. So family, the Holy Spirit guides us into all understanding via the precepts. Here a little and there a little. Let's go to Psalm 119 and let's read verse 27. That's Psalm 119 verse 27. It says, "Make me to understand the way of thy precepts. So shall I talk of thy wondrous works." You see, family, when you start understanding the Most High's precepts, not man's precepts, not Nebo's precepts, but when you understand the Father's precepts, you can't help but talk of his wondrous works. Stay in Psalm 119 and drop down to verse 40. That's Psalm 119 verse 40. It says, "Behold, I have longed after thy precepts. Quicken me in thy righteousness." Look at this, family. It is a natural progression. When you are longing for the precepts, then you begin to be quickened in righteousness. And we understand that righteousness is the right relationship with the Spirit in elements. Now, family, drop down to Psalm 119 verses 55 and 56. That's Psalm 119 verses 55 and 56. It says, "I have remembered thy name, O Lord, in the night, and I have kept thy law. This I had because I kept thy precepts." Family, did y'all just read that? I have remembered thy name, O Lord, in the night, and I have kept thy law. This I had because I kept thy precepts. Family, the word they used for the word night in this verse in your Strongs is H3915. That word is pronounced la yalah. It is a word that means a twist of the light. It is a twist of instruction. It is a twist of law. That is what this word means. This word is not only used for the word night, but it is also used for the word season and midnight. So it is telling you that I have remembered thy name, O Lord, in the night, in the darkness, in the confusion, in the tribulation, in the oppression. I have remembered thy name, O Lord, in Babylon. Even surrounded by all of this wickedness, I have remembered thy name. And then look what it says. This I had because I kept thy precepts. You see, family, when you are in the midst of this type of confusion that is all around us in this wicked world, if you want to remember anything of note, if you want to remember truth, if you want to remember his name and the character of his name and everything that is associated with his name, all of those higher sentiments, if you want to remember the origin, if you want to remember the light, then you have to keep his precepts. When you understand this, then you understand that the path of the precepts was always going to lead to the books of remembrance. Now, family, for those of you who are taking notes, I want you to write down the days of remembrance. Write that down. The days of remembrance. Now, family, let's go to the book of Jubilees, chapter 6, and let's read verse 23. That's the book of Jubilees, chapter 6, and let's read verse 23. It says, "And on the new moon of the first month, and on the new moon of the fourth month, and on the new moon of the seventh month, and on the new moon of the 10th month are the days of remembrance and the days of the seasons in the 4 divisions of the year. These are written and ordained as a testimony forever." So, family, these 4 days are the days of remembrance. And these 4 days are the first day of every season. Now, family, let's go to the book of remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai. And let's go to Bedal, chapter 13, and let's read verse 83. That's the book of remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai. And let's go to Bedal, chapter 13, verse 83. That's Bedal, chapter 13, verse 83. It says, "And each season shall begin on the 4th day of the week, and it shall have a day at the end for a purification day, and it shall be a day of the week. And you are to use this day to prepare to receive the gift and blessing of the next season." So, what this verse is letting you know, that at the end of every season, that day before, you should be purifying yourself so you can get ready to receive the gifts that come with every season on the days of remembrance. Now, we talked about those gifts during the series we did on the Holy Watchers. With the spring, you're getting new life and renewal. With the summer, you're getting joy and happiness. With the fall, you're reaping the benefits of gathering and getting a renewal in your determination. And in the winter, you are getting to rest. These are spiritual gifts. So we want to make sure that we are preparing ourselves to receive these gifts. And these gifts will arrive like clockwork on the first day of each season. There are 91 days in each season. Anokeesed's day is not counted within the 91 because it is an intercalary day. It is the gap between winter and the spring. Now, the first of the days of remembrance, which is also the first day of spring, is also the first day of the year. So this day, this is our New Year's Day. Let's go into the book of remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai, and let's read Bedal, chapter 13, verses 90 through 108. That's Bedal, chapter 13, verses 90 through 108. It says, "And on the day of the new year, you are to anticipate the arrival of your father Anokeesed, and you are to acknowledge in your souls together your need to be forgiven. And on that day, you are to gently and with real intent and with true purpose of heart confess the sins of your life to one another and to Anokeesed. And when this rich fellowship is completed, you are to wash in water from the brook of the meadow, and let each person wear wool on this day, and carry with them the he is worthy plant, so that the spirit of rich forgiveness may abide with them and linger in their hearts. Now I'm going to stop right here just for a second, just so I can let you all know that you can only do what you can do. If you don't have water from the brook of the meadow, then you have to wash in whatever water you have access to. And if you don't know what the he is worthy plant is, then you can't use the he is worthy plant, at least not yet. The Father is going to make all of these things known and available to those who are truly seeking the ancient paths. So when you read these things, only do what you can do. This right here is showing you how it is done in a righteous, holy community. This is the Ma'in way. Let's continue at verse 92. It says, and everyone is to have their hair up all that day until you enter in to make your confessions. And your hair up is to be an acknowledgement that this time you are not a victim of Matsar, but you have chosen to join your spirit with him in some way for which you will confess. And that night you are to prepare your place of rest to be fresh and clean, and you are to provide a pillow for Anokeesed to rest his head upon as he sleeps with you. And on that day you shall have your habitation also prepared to be fresh and new, and you shall have a pillow of pure white linen that is made white in the light of the sun, and the pillow shall be filled with clean and combed wool, and it is to be placed in the middle of your resting place early in the day. And all is to be made clean and ready for Anokeesed to come and sleep with you that night. And the pillow is for him to lay his head upon, and you shall make room for him in your resting place when you lie down. And if you are married, his pillow is to have an opening on both ends that are yellow, and he will sleep between you. And every man, woman, and child, wherever they sleep, will have a pillow for Anokeesed. And the prisoner, and he who travels in the way, and those who seek their prey, and any who go to perform a task, shall find a place to rest with their father Anokeesed on this day. And the domination of the wicked will not prevent the righteous from sleeping with their father. And if you are not married, the pillow shall be open on one end, and it shall be yellow on the open end, and it shall be laid on their glory side, with the open end toward the sleeping person. Y'all, the glory side is the right side. And the man and his wife shall inhabit the side of the resting place that is shown upon the heavenly tablets, the man being on the glory side, and the woman on the power side. So the man is going to be on the right side, and the woman is going to be on the left side. And this day is a Sabbath. So understand, you're going to treat this day as a Sabbath. And on the morrow, on the day of the Lord, all who are able are to prepare the skins of animals for clothing, and the women are to make clothing from them. And at the end of this time, the needles of the women are to be blessed and established in their rightful place, as a sure possession of all the women in Ma'in. And on that day, after these blessings, you are to all count your possessions before one another. And while the storehouse can provide for you with things to use in your daily lives, only my Father, Anokeesed, can give you possessions. And you are to consider your possessions to be only that which He has given you. And everything else in your life you have only the use of according to His kind provision. And this is so that the satisfaction of possessions will be far away from the inhabitants of Maim. And on the following day, which is the first day of the year, you are to eat nothing whose blood has been shed, but you are to bring sheep with you in all of your comings and goings on that day. And they are to be present for the worship and fellowship of that day. And you must see that nothing brings them fear or dismay. And just as sheep followed with me when I went with Yatsakad and Kava out of Eden, so shall they go out with you on that day. For sheep and their wool feel the richness of my forgiveness, because I began to become temporal with man on that day. And the presence and the spirit of forgiveness shall abound. And everyone who is of age shall come before the altar before me, every man and woman, and shall put yellow paint upon their glory ear, to show forth their willingness to listen to the voice of Kai, who is sent to guide them in the way. And by this, His voice will become clear in your hearts during your daily walk in the coming year. And they all shall have yellow paint on their glory thumb, to show forth before all men and the Urkadeshi that they are willing to bless Anokeesed in the humble offering of their life in loving kindness. And they all shall paint their big toe on the glory side, to show that they are determined to only act out of loving kindness toward their fellows, and put forth their hand to support the visions of one another. And on that day, the men of service shall hear from the people their longings and desires, to walk in holiness of heart and to find fulfillment as they journey on the pathway back to Eden. And these men shall renew their determination to act in behalf of Anokeesed and his son, to bless the people in these holy desires. And they shall perform healings on this day, according as I direct, even as I did for the finger of Kava from the thorn. And from the Sabbath until the first day of the year is over, let nothing pass into the lips of the righteous, except by thorns or by drinking, so that the dread of you shall abound among the Dekadarshi. And it came to pass that after Matzah explained the day of the new year, that he spoke to Enoch further, and he said, Since the council of heaven, where Anokeesed declared that he would go into the temporal world himself to rescue his children, the great Holy One was anxious in his heart, and he worried whether his children would love his son, and if they would respect him and honor his words and his pleadings in their hearts, for he knew that his son was their only way back to him. And as the righteous and the wicked among men began to divide in the midst of the earth, this question was before his face, and it seemed that all of the handiwork of his love was groping to find their way. Okay, family, and we're going to talk about the rest of that in a few minutes. But that is what we are supposed to be doing on the new year. It's a day about real repentance and introspection. Forget a New Year's resolution. Repent. Confess your sins to one another. Acknowledge the fact that this sin that you took part of connected you to the devil, and repent and move away from that sin and continue to go forward. Remember, this is not only the new year, but this is the spring. This is the season of renewal and new life. If you want new life, find something to repent for. Now, family, let's go into the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek, chapter 10, and let's read verse 50. Melchizedek, chapter 10, verse 50. It says, "There is a day in the New Year worship when everyone meets together to confess their sin, and that day is the purification day of the entire new year. And that day is to be done in the setting of families in their villages, so that their expressions of confession can be free and clearly spoken by the shy and also the little children, without the inhibitions of a large assembly." So, family, this is something that is done with those who are closest to you. Now, family, there's a lot more here about the new year in the Melchizedek book. And you're going to find that with all of these holy days, there's a lot more in the Melchizedek book. We are not going to be going through all of that today. Like I said at the start of this lesson, right now, I just want you to understand how to find the holy days, when to celebrate them, what to do, to the best of your ability. We're not trying to get all of the things that we can't do when we aren't in a righteous community right now. We can only do what we can do. And this is a large pill to swallow. So only put in your mouth what you can chew. As a matter of fact, just drink stuff right now. Just let it be liquid. Let it be milk. And be trying to eat no meat right now. Now let's go back into the book of Remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai. And let's go to Bidal chapter 13, and let's read verses 109 through 116. That's Bidal chapter 13, verses 109 through 116. It says, "And in the midst of this perplexity of Anokeesed, there came a wonderfully strong woman who relieved his anxiety to know whether his children would love his son. And it was on the day that Edra named the Aral Sea. And as Edra named the sea while standing in the water, this lovely one came who is dearly beloved by Anokeesed, and it was Miloo. And she was very strong in her determination and in her love for the Lord. And she had learned how to endure all the hardships of life. And in the midst of the multitude, she got herself upon a table of the fish yard. And as Edra spoke to the sea, she made great declarations to the multitude assembled, and her voice carried out over the water. And all who were present could hear her words, albeit they were not loud. Now she is called Miloo, because she has consecrated her life in full measure to give it to Matzah the lamb. And she declared with a clear voice to all who were assembled the meaning of the living waters and the righteousness of the waters of Eden that were flowing into their land. And she expounded to them all the necessity of giving their lives to the son of Anokeesed. And she rehearsed to them the rich meaning of such an act of consecration. And after Edra made his appeal for the people to be baptized in the waters of the Aral Sea, she went into the waters first, at the bidding of Edra. And she went down, and came up out of the waters, in like manner of the song of the dance. And the waters gently waved up and down together with her, out of their delight. And it came to pass that all of the multitude followed her example, and they went into the water, and they clung to all of her exhortations, to give their lives fully to Matzah the Lamb, holding nothing back. And it was known that the presence of Kai had prepared the way for this to happen. And in the midst of the exclamations of those in the multitude of their intent to give their lives wholly to Matzah the Lamb, all of Elda erupted into singing, and the sound of it reached into the soul of Anokeesed, and he was brought to comfort, and his longings were answered, that his children would choose to love his son. And that day became for Anokeesed a treasured day, which he marks every year as he lives with his children. And the day became known as the day of the measure of Miloo, when the father was comforted by the richness of the gifts of the lives of the righteous to his son. And they gave in full measure, withholding nothing. And this day is very dear to the heart of Anokeesed. And it happened on the 15th day of the season of renewal. So this is on the 15th day of spring. Now, family, let's go into the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek, chapter 10, and let's read verse 58. That's Melchizedek chapter 10, verse 58. This is speaking about Miloo's day. Here's what it says. It says, and the men on this day are to intervene to broaden the awareness of the people throughout the coming year, that they can look to discern the spirit and presence of Matzah in all the elements that sustain their daily lives, and teach the children to do this naturally by speaking of it often. And they are to see that all the people have available to them the holy knowledge of the spirits of life that give life to the Urkadeshi, so that what he feels is close to them and always available. So family, this is showing you what the men are supposed to do on this day. And if you keep reading, it tells you that the women should go and bless all the waters, the wells, the creeks, and the rivers on that day. And there's more than just that. But like I said, we aren't going to go into all the details for these holy days right now. But I do want to encourage you to go and read all these other things that we're not reading today in the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek. Now, family, let's go back to the book of Jubilees, chapter 6, verse 11. That's Jubilees chapter 6, verse 11. It says, on this account, he spake to thee that thou shouldest make a covenant with the children of Israel in this month upon the mountain with an oath, and that thou shouldest sprinkle blood upon them because of all the words of the covenant which the Lord made with them forever. So now we are seeing that a covenant was made upon a mountain. Stay in Jubilees chapter 6 and let's read verses 16 through 21. That's Jubilees chapter 6 verses 16 through 21. It says, he set his bow in the cloud for a sign of the eternal covenant, that there should not again be a flood on the earth to destroy it all the days of the earth. For this reason, it is ordained and written on the heavenly tablets that they should celebrate the Feast of Weeks in this month once a year, to renew the covenant every year. And this whole festival was celebrated in heaven from the day of creation till the days of Noah, 26 jubilees, 5 weeks of years, and Noah and his sons observed it. For 7 jubilees and 1 week of years, till the day of Noah's death. And from the day of Noah's death, his sons did away with it until the days of Abraham, and they eat blood. But Abraham observed it, and Isaac and Jacob and his children observed it up to thy days. And in thy days the children of Israel forgot it, until ye celebrated it anew on this mountain. And do the command of the children of Israel to observe this festival in all their generations for a commandment unto them. 1 day in the year in this month they shall celebrate the festival, for it is the feast of weeks and the feast of first fruits. This feast is twofold and of a double nature, according to what is written and engraven concerning it. Celebrate it. So now, family, you are going to begin to see the way the ancient holy days influenced the holy days that are being kept today. Let's go to the book of Exodus, chapter 34, and let's read verse 22. That's Exodus chapter 34, verse 22. It says, "And thou shalt observe the feast of weeks, of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the feast of ingathering at the year's end." Let's look at where it says, "And thou shalt observe the feast of weeks." Let's look at that word weeks in the Strongs. In the Strongs, it is H7620. That word is Shabuwa. Oh, look at that. It says, "And thou shalt observe the feast of Shabuwa, of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the feast of ingathering at the year's end." Now, family, let's go to the book of Remembrance of Enoch. And let's go to Bidal chapter 13. That's the book of Remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai. And we're going to go to Bidal chapter 13. And let's read verses 117 through 120. That's Bidal 13, verses 117 through 120. It says, "And again it came to pass that Matzah explained a holy day to Enoch. And he said, I tell you these things, for in heaven, where the abode of the great Holy One is, there was a concern that the righteous children of Anokeesed would have adequate support to sustain them, seeing that they were in the midst of the 1/3 who fell, and who would not come to counsel with the call of Matzah the Lamb. And Anokeesed was burdened with the prospect that his lovely ones, who gave their lives to his son, would come to be hard-pressed by the corruptions of evil, and that they would be left to feel alone and weak, because the Urkadeshi could not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, insomuch that there would be no end for their tolerance for the wicked. And Anokeesed saw from his dwelling place that Enoch had great determinations to find the element of righteousness that would protect the righteous and enable them to find support. And Enoch determined that he would divide the sons of men according to the measure of the holiness and sanctity of marriage. And he instructed the Urkadeshi plainly as to their limits in their tolerance for evil. And by his instruction he set in motion the support of the Urkadeshi for the righteous. And in the days of Enoch, this day was called the day of instruction. But after Shem, it was called Shabuwa. And thus we see that because the righteous gave their lives to Matzah the Lamb, he was able to intervene to instruct Enoch so he may divide the sons of men to gain comfort for his father, Anokeesed, in his burden, to know if his children would have support. And this day fell on a jubilee of days from the day of the measure of Miloo. So this is talking about this day. This day occurs 50 days after the measure of Miloo. So now let's talk about what you should have in your notes so far. You should have the days of remembrance. And then after that, you should have the new year as one of these days of remembrance. Then you should have Miloo's day. Then you should have the day of instruction, or Shabuwa. Now, family, let's go into the book of remembrance of 1st and 2nd Achi. And let's go to 1st Achi, chapter 1, and let's read verses 62 and 63. 1st Achi, chapter 1, verses 62 and 63. It says, "Now these things have been hidden from all men." Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and start reading. Let's see. Let's go ahead and start reading at verse 61. Let's read 61, 62, and 63. Okay, 61. "Now behold, another great mystery. It was this great man establishing and defining the priesthood of Messiah in element, that it could be said of him that Messiah would be ordained after the order of Melchizedek. And we too can likewise participate in the doings of creation and the affairs of salvation, because of the religion of Shabuwa. And by this great man Melchizedek, we too, being called and ordained by God into the holy order of the priesthood, can intervene in these days of wickedness and vengeance, insomuch that the earth may rest. And we too can herald the deeds of Messiah, and the destruction of the wicked in tribulation times. For all this do the Urkadeshi call Melchizedek Michael. And for this did Messiah say by the mouth of the prophets, Michael will help me. Now, these things have been hidden from all men, but have now been revealed into the writings of Achi, grandson of Melchizedek. And for this reason, it is a commandment of God that starting with the waving of an omer, so y'all, the waving of an omer is also Miloo's day. So you can also call Miloo's day the waving of the omer. So it says, for this reason it is a commandment of God that starting with the waving of the omer, the trump shall sound in all the camps of the righteous who have a high priest, and shall continue sounding each Sabbath sunrise for 7 Sabbaths, until the 15th day of the 3rd month, at which time the great covenant of Melchizedek shall be renewed and heralded to all the earth, and the eternal proclamation shall be rehearsed to all the Urkadeshi, that Messiah is the prince of the host. And it came to pass that Shem kept this year by year, even as they did in heaven since creation. Ladies and gentlemen, let me explain to you what we just read. So, Miloo's day, or the waving of an omer, after that, the first Sabbath after the waving of an omer, from that Sabbath for 7 more Sabbaths, then the trump is to sound at each Sabbath sunrise for 7 Sabbaths. For 7 Sabbaths the trump sounds, and it calls all of the Urkadeshi. And the Urkadeshi come together in that place to be reminded of the covenant that they made upon the mountain. Where have we heard this verbiage before? Oh, that's right. We just read this in the book of Jubilees. Let's read it again. The book of Jubilees, chapter 6, verse 11. On this account he spake to thee, that thou shouldest make a covenant with the children of Israel in this month upon the mountain with an oath, and that thou shouldest sprinkle blood upon them because of all the words of the covenant which the Lord made with them forever. So in Enoch's day, this was called the day of instruction. But when Shem came forth to establish his great work, it was called Shabuwa. And look what it says in verse 63. And it came to pass that Shem kept this year by year, even as they did in heaven since creation. This is also in the book of Jubilees. Let's look again at Jubilees chapter 6, verse 18. It says, and this whole festival was celebrated in heaven from the day of creation till the days of Noah. Now, family, I want to point out that if this concept of Shabuwa is new to you, then I have entire lessons about Shabuwa. Abdullah has some good lessons about Shabuwa. Just go through the videos and look for the name Shabuwa. Now, I want to show you how Shabuwa moved the Messiah. So stay in the book of remembrance of 1st Achi. And let's go to 1st Achi chapter 8. And let's read verses 57 through 59. That's 1st Achi chapter 8, verses 57 through 59. It says, now in Jerusalem, the people of the church would not renew Shabuwa year by year, as the people of the temple religion did not keep the same Sabbath day as the sounding of the trump of summons. You see that, y'all? They didn't keep the same Sabbath day. We talked about this in our lesson about the calendar of Enoch. We talked about how many went astray in the way that they calculated the new year and their Sabbath. Anyway, let's continue. It says, now in Jerusalem, the people of the church could not renew Shabuwa year by year, as the people of the temple religion would not keep the same Sabbath day, and the sounding of the trump of summons, when it was not their Sabbath, would cause a great uproar. So they were obliged to renew Shabuwa in Sekeka, and also in other various places in Israel. Sekeka was an Essene community. Let me continue. And also in other various places in Israel, where the people were familiar with the people of the church and would accept the sounding of the trump when it was not their Sabbath day. And in the 16th year of Messiah, he heard for the first time on Sabbath morning at sunrise the sounding of the trump of summons for Shabuwa. And Messiah was much moved upon at the sound of it, and it pierced him to his very center, and he cried out and hastened himself to see. And the thing so moved him that the elders of the place, when they heard of it, they sent for the men of renown in that place. And it was decided that he should go in the company of his fellows, who were his youthful companions, and they should go unto Sekeka for the duration of the weeks of Shabuwa. And the men of renown there could teach him, and he could learn from Zebedee all things concerning Shabuwa. And word was sent ahead that Messiah was coming to Sekeka for the renewing of Shabuwa, And the men of the place made haste to purify themselves and set all things in order. And there for the rest of the 7 weeks, Messiah and all his troop were instructed in the matters of Shabuwa. And they commenced with the war in heaven, and expounded unto them all things. And the men opened up unto them a knowledge of the city of Enoch, and they rehearsed the establishment of Shabuwa, and all the history of that religion with Shem and Sedekadellabab. And every Sabbath morning Messiah would accompany the trumpeters at sunrise. And thus the 7 weeks passed. Now, family, let's go into the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek, chapter 10, and let's read verses 61 through 63. Wow, look at that. We were just in First Achi and we read chapter 1, verses 61 through 63, and now we're in Melchizedek, chapter 10, reading verses 61 through 63. Anyway, Melchizedek, chapter 10, verses 61 through 63. It says, "And the day of instruction is what the ancients called Shabuwa, before the days of Melchizedek. And he continued to speak, and he said, On the day of instruction, the men are to intervene with their agency, using the element of righteousness by the sound of a trump, to instruct the Urkadeshi in the needful way of the times, to limit their tolerance for evil influences on the Lord's righteous, and to bring blessings and protections according to the need. And this intervention is in behalf of Matzah, the Lamb, and it is in his behalf, in view of his burden, and his burden is to be on their hearts, and they are to love him with compassion for a jubilee of days. And during this jubilee of days, they are, each and every one, to mourn with him in his times of sorrow, and they are to stand up as his protectors in the face of all that troubles him, and they are to make clear determinations to express their loving concern for him, and they are to instruct the Urkadeshi in remedies with exactitude and firm determination. And on the day of instruction, the men, even all of them in their order of service, are to be deliberate with their interventions, with confidence and great power after the trump of declaration, to look out with their eyes as they behold the sunrise, with the spirit of challenge on his behalf, and instruction should flow towards the causes of his burden, as one dear friend stands for another, and they are to be fearless as his advocates, not measuring the cost to themselves. And at the sound of the trump, the Urkadeshi will thrust themselves forward on his behalf, and they will overcome all restraint that comes against them. Rejoice, O heaven, and all mountains sing of him. And family, there's a lot more on Shabuwa and the day of instruction if you keep reading. But like I said, we're not going into all of the details. I just wanted to make sure that you recognize it. And you have to understand that this Jubilee encompasses 7 Sabbaths. And then on that final day, that 50th day, then you're going to have the day of instruction. Now, family, after the day of instruction, then your next holy day is going to be another day of remembrance. And this would be the first day of summer. Remember that we read about the days of remembrance in Jubilees chapter 6, verse 23. All right, family, moving right along. In your notes for this next section, you want to write down Feast of Tranquility, and you can put in parentheses Passover. Let's go into the book of Remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai, and let's read chapter 13, verses 121 through 129. That's Bidal 13, 121 through 129. It says, "And again the Lord instructed Enoch, and he said, And there is a holy day in the memorable passages of my Father, and it is called the Feast of Tranquility, and it is not a Sabbath. And 2 days before this day is a Sabbath. And on that day you shall have a place prepared where you sleep, and you shall make it fresh and new. And you shall have a pillow of pure linen, filled with clean and combed wool, so Anokeesed can lay his head down when he sleeps with you that night. And the day he sleeps with you is a Sabbath, and your hair may be down, for it is not a day when a person is held to account. And on the morrow you are to arise early in each of your encampments, and you are to select pure young maidens to dance before the inhabitants of your villages, and they are to dance to the place where the Isib is kept. And all of the women are to obtain Isib, and it is to be ground with stones, even as Matzah the lamb did for Kavah, the day before the day of tranquility." I'm going to stop right there for a second, family, just to let you know, if you don't already know, the Isib is the wheat. Okay, let's continue. "And it is to be cooked with milk, and it is to be sweetened with honey. And do not withhold the honey to be miserly. And it is to have leavening, for it is the bread of peace. And then on the next day, which is a jubilee of days from the day of instruction," so this is 50 days after Shabuwa. "And then on the next day, which is a jubilee of days from the day of instruction, you are to eat the bread in a feast. And the purpose of the bread is for you to be free from fear and intimidation. And you are to pray for one another, and request from Anokeesed protection from fear. For that night the Urkadeshi shall issue forth to identify their own, and they shall suppress the fear and presence of Matzar the Decadent by a mighty hand. And woe unto those whom they ignore with their love." And the Lord rehearsed to him the memory of the agony and distress of heart of his father Anokeesed, when the midst of the peace and tranquility of Eden, when in the midst of the peace and tranquility of Eden, there came a shriek of fear to penetrate the stillness, and all of Elda and Eden and the host of the heavenly ones were filled with dread and dismay of alarm. And y'all, we know this is talking about when Semihaza, when Matzar the Decadent, when the devil fell as a meteorite into Eden and disturbed the peace. Anyway, verse 126, "And in that day Matzah the lamb was able to come to intervene in the face of their fear, and he caused the angels of heaven, who are called the Urkadeshi, to pass over in Eden to suppress Semihaza. And he met them in the place where they fled, and he slept with them. And on the morrow he brought the first protection elements known to man, and it was the Kelly and the Kelly bread. And the purpose of passage is to protect the righteous from fright and fear and from harm, and the destructive forces of evil from lies and from false visions, and from the effects of the works of darkness, and from the consequences of the temporal world. And they are contrary to the will of Anokeesed. And this can be because the first day of tranquility was established in the purity of the natural world of Eden. And thus Matzah the Lamb intervened again, being enabled by the acts of righteousness which occurred on the day of the measure of Miloo. For Anokeesed applies all of his holy days to all of his children. And this day is very dear to the heart of Anokeesed, For the protection of his lovely ones is magnified on that day, and his heart can rest from their being troubled with fear. And all of the holy host of heaven count the days with him, from one holy day to the next. So family, if you're not understanding how this day actually relates to the Passover, how this day is the true Passover, I have a whole lesson dedicated to it. Just look in my videos about Passover. Now family, let's go to the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek. And let's read Melchizedek chapter 10, verses 68 through 73. That's Melchizedek chapter 10, verses 68 through 73. It says, "And Melchizedek said, The holy day of the Feast of Tranquility is a constant reminder to us that the tranquility of Eden can be brought to our daily lives here in the temporal world by our trust in the Lord and by our compassion for the oppressed. And all the Urkadeshi are perfectly aware of all the intentions of Anokeesed and the harmonious relationships established by Kava and Yatsakad. And what they did to transform Olam into Eden is present before their eyes. And there was no shadow of corruption in those friendships of rich bonding together. And into this marvelous scene of delight and happiness comes a wayward child of a comet. And the disruption was not just the crashing sounds and the shrieks heralding the sounds of death into Eden, but it was the introduction of fear into the tranquility of Eden, and oppression shattered the foundations of the happiness of Eden, and fear was the principal bearer of oppression. And our first parents were oppressed by fear and fled the only place they had known as home, never to return again. And the ignorance of the rebellious was manifested because it took Semihaza a little while to realize he had caused fear. And he brought fear with him because when he broke away from his mother, he did not know where he was going, and he was afraid. And his rebellion was the author of fear. And when he discovered that he had control over the objects of creation with fear, he felt the exhilaration of dominance and power over his fellows, and he became determined that he would continue to use fear to oppress. But two souls slept in the arms of Anokeesed that night, and compassion flowed out and spilled over to cover the oppressed with loving kindness, and fear evaporated away utterly. And the tranquility of Eden was restored with the arms of Anokeesed. And of their own accord, the Urkadeshi were moved within themselves with a new awareness brought on by the witness of fear, and their souls overflowed with protective instincts, and they spontaneously rose up and passed over first the sleeping figures, and then the resting place of Semihaza. And he was quieted by them and wanted to hide himself. And now it is forever etched in the minds of the Urkadeshi that they will pass over the oppressed to steal the voice of fear, and they will pass over the oppressors to bring them to an awareness of their smallness in the face of the power of the truth. Family, did y'all just read that? Our oppressors are small in the face of the power of the truth. Now, family, let's go into the book of Remembrance of Enoch. Actually, before you do that, write in your notes. Write down this next section, the celebration of IKAR or IKAR. IKAR. Celebration of IKAR. And you can put in parentheses, first fruits. Okay. Now, let's go to the book of Remembrance of Enoch. We're going to go to Bedal, and we're going to read chapter 13, verses 130 through 134. That's Bidal chapter 13, verses 130 through 134. It says, "And again Matsa the Lamb spoke to Enoch, and he told him another account of the troubled heart of Anokeesed, when all of the people everywhere were in the pains of hunger, and the wicked in all the northlands were in much want, as were the righteous also who dwelt there, and all the lands of Anak, and the high places to the east, and the land of Rabshalash, and also the encampment of Nod, had the righteous in them in the distress of want. And Enoch saw it, and he knew of the day of which the Lord spoke. And Enoch saw the sorrow of Anokeesed, and he was moved. And Matsa told him, I saw my father sorrowing as he traveled in the way, and I beheld him bent over in his grief. And I intervened to come before IKAR, and I taught him how to plow. And the presence of my father rested in the plowed fields of the meadows, and on the open plain. And it is a happy day in the regions of Elda, with the holy host of heaven. And it is a day for the foundation of the storehouse, and the day of the celebration of IKAR, and all of the righteous shall partake of the first fruits, on the day in which they receive them with prayer and the joy of thankfulness. And in addition to that, on this day, which is a jubilee of days from the day of tranquility. So this day is 50 days after the day of tranquility. Are you guys noticing a theme? These holy days, aside from the days of remembrance, these holy days are all 50 days away from each other. So you have Miloo's day, and then another 50 days. Then you have the day of instruction, then another 50 days. Then you have the day of tranquility, then another 50 days, and you've come to the celebration of IKAR. Anyway, let's keep reading. And in addition to that, on this day, which is a jubilee of days from the day of tranquility, it is a day of rich thanksgiving, and of joining the hearts of the righteous to the hearts of the Urkadeshi. And on that day all of the righteous shall feast, and the remaining first fruits shall be eaten, with the feeling that there is plenty for all. And the children shall rejoice and sing, and rich fellowship shall be obtained by the people rehearsing stories of the kindness of Anokeesed to provide for them in the storehouse. And repentance shall abound, and the element of righteousness shall be used to join the people with the Urkadeshi. And Ebedel shall find instruction on the high places of the land concerning the desires of Anokeesed in his heart, to have the righteous view creation as being their home, and belonging to all the handiwork of his loving kindness. Now, family, let's go into the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek, chapter 10, and let's read verses 82 and 83. That's Melchizedek, chapter 10, verses 82 and 83. It says, And I can see that the feast of IKAR truly represents a vital step in bringing many conditions of Eden into the temporal world, because in Eden, all the Urkadeshi took care of our first parents and fed them in abundance according to their need, and animals were their friends, and husband and wife and children had no need to depart away from one another, and the Urkadeshi prospered in their happiness, and their fulfillment was before their eyes, and parts of the earth that only had been walked on now held her children in rich embrace. So, on this important day, by the grace of their lovely Redeemer, and with deliberateness, the women are to bring the celebrations of Elda to the people, and they shall bear witness in their joy of the Father's love in sharing and in song. And Anokeesed loves the singing and praises of little children, and the women are to lead the children in song before all the congregation and the assembly of the people, and a true spirit of thanksgiving will mark this day, and faith will be enlarged with a rich anticipation for the days to come. It's like this holy day is Chafatiel's time to shine. But not only Chafatiel, because all of the Urkadeshi provide for us and help us. Now, family, after the celebration of IKAR, the feast of IKAR, after that, then the next holy day is another day of remembrance, and this would be the first day of fall. Now, we will talk about Ingathering at a later date, because Ingathering, even though it is an ancient feast, it's more of an ancient tradition or a custom, because it's not one of these holy days. Still, it does have a lot of history, and it's definitely something that we should do. But now we come to another day of remembrance, which is the first day of fall. Now, moving right along, let's go in the book of remembrance of Enoch let's go to Bidal chapter 13, and let's read verses 137 and 138. And you can write down in your notes the day of remembrance. And this is not to be confused with the days of remembrance. So now we're coming to a day that is called the Day of Remembrance, but it is not one of the days that is the first day of every season. So write down Day of Remembrance, and let's go to Bidal chapter 13, and let's read verses 137 and 138. That's Bidal chapter 13, verses 137 and 138. It says, "And Matzah intervened again to call Enoch to the encampment of Machpelah, and to the barren waste places of the high plain in the east of Mahujah. And he brought Enoch dreams of instruction, so he could divide the waters of Sinir. And this was so that every man would be born into the world, to have a conscience, to know right from wrong, and good from evil. And in this way, the righteous could choose more easily to cling to virtue, and they could love their fellows and become members of the congregations of Ma'im. And thus came the day to celebrate that man is responsible to remember. And it was a jubilee of days from the day of the celebration of IKAR. And on this day the rocks are called to remembrance, and all of the righteous eat together and rehearse to one another the testimony of their pathway to virtue, and their ability to speak plainly and truthful shall be expanded on this day, and the gift of charity shall be embraced in the midst of all those who desire to be holy." Family, this day is also called the Day of Remembering Virtue. So maybe that can help distinguish it. Day of Remembrance or Day of Remembering Virtue. Now, family, let's go into the book of remembrance of Melchizedek. And let's read Melchizedek chapter 10, verses 86 through 88. That's Melchizedek chapter 10, verses 86 through 88. It says, "And so there became a day of remembering virtue, and Ebedel is the rock of witness for the day of remembrance, and the stones of the Urim are the elders of Ebedel for this day. And on this day the men are to intervene with their agency, using the elements of righteousness to call upon Ebedel to remember the truth of the ages, things past, present, and of the future. And importantly with that, the men among the scribes are to step forward in power and sure determination to strengthen the ability and readiness of parents to teach their children all things useful and good and holy about Anokeesed and the Urkadeshi, together with a strong knowledge of their spiritual heritage coming down to them in their families and among their people. And Ebedel will be their resource, with the stones of the Urim leading the way, and the rocks of birthplaces being a sure guide for those who seek to discover their visions of created purpose. And the people, each one should be encouraged to go there, and if they cannot go there, then they should select a rock that knows them personally, and discuss with the Lord all his hopes in the day he created them. And Ebedel is charged with a knowledge of the truth, and she will bear a strong witness at the judgment, because she longs to remember, because she long remembers and can verify, because she long remembers and can verify all that is written in the books that are opened on that day. And on this day of remembering virtue, the power of it and the reach of it is applied to all the righteous of the earth among every people and tongue. And the men are to view their intervention to apply broadly to all the families of the righteous whenever they are found. And the stones of the Urim are principal in the last days and during our tribulation times, and that which is brought by them should be searched for indications of personal enlightenment. And let's go ahead and read verse 89. It says, "And the women are to recount to the people and to the Urkadeshi the meaning of the names of the people, and of the joyous traditions that arise from the truth of their righteous forebearers. And they are to recount special personal days to one another, and share in the joy of them, and tell stories in their villages about births and passages of life, and recount honorable achievements and successes." And I was able to feel in this moment that the account of Adah's forgiveness was repeated over and over again on this day. And family, it should be apparent, or should be becoming apparent. You should be beginning to understand why we had to do the series on the Holy Watchers before going into the calendar and these holy days. Because the Holy Watchers are such an integral part of the holy days when you understand the origin and the history, when you have that light. Now, family, let's go back into the book of remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai, and let's go to Bedal chapter 13, and let's read verses 139 through 144. And under this section you can write celebration of new oil, and in parentheses you can put the feast of dedication. So, celebration of new oil. We're going to go to Bedal chapter 13, and we're going to read verses 139 through 144. It reads, "And it came to pass that Matzah the lamb continued to instruct Enoch in how to divide the days of men. And he said that there was a time when Anokeesed was weary, and he was troubled in his soul, for it seemed sometimes that his children would not find their way to dwell with him. And his desires to dwell with his children is that which is foremost on the mind of the great Holy One. And Matzah the lamb beheld the desires of his father, and he set a course to intervene, to establish a sure pathway for man to walk in, so they could fulfill the desires of his father and dwell with his holy ones. And when Yatsakad found the grief of despair in the face of the sins of his children, insomuch that he lost all hope of ever returning to Eden to dwell with Anokeesed. Matsa beheld it, and he stepped into the waters of the brook Baka to intervene with the covenant that he made with Gabriel. And he raised Yatsakad up, and he was fallen down in his grief, and he named him Gabriel. And he covenanted before Anokeesed and Yatsakad in the presence of rocks of witnesses, that Yatsakad and all of his righteous children would someday return to Eden to feel the desire of both their hearts. And with this covenant, the pathway back to Eden was come to dwell in both their hearts, and the division of days measures that pathway. And the celebration of new oil is a jubilee of days from the day of remembering virtue. And it is a day to bless the oil of the righteous, and it is a time to express thankfulness for the gift of life that can be led in the presence of the Holy One who lives in Eden. And it is a day when the congregations of the righteous are spoken to by Anokeesed, and they are guided in the way according to their needs from their kind Father. And it is a day for all of the longings of the righteous to live with their Father, to fulfill the desires of their hearts, to be expressed. And all of these longings are shared with him and with one another, and the desire for wickedness to be done away with. For the righteousness to cover the earth will comfort Anokeesed. And it is a day to pray for our loved ones who are bound down in the midst of the domain of the wicked. And the rocks of Ebedel shall be instructed concerning them, and they are to be anointed together with all of the people on that day. So family, this day where all of the oil for the righteous is blessed for the new year, this day is about expressing thankfulness for the gift of life. And that leads to the presence of our Father, of Anokeesed. Now, let's stop for a second and talk about the lies of Aaron. You see, Aaron taught that only the high priest could go and be in the presence of the Father. And he had to do that in the Holy of Holies, where nobody could see him. And so what that gave us was the hijack, which is the Feast of Dedication. Now, we did it the right way. We understood what it was really about, but we also were connecting it to that temple. But now that we understand that Aaron was full of lies, now we can see what it was really about. It was always about this new oil. Are you hearing me? Look there at the bottom of page 449 in the book of Remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai. There's a note. It says, the golden color of the oil feels the presence of Anokeesed. That's why in the book of Revelation, the New Jerusalem is said to have streets of gold, because Anokeesed will be felt there. At the end of the day, the Feast of Dedication and the celebration of new oil are really pointing us to the same place. We are just going to take the lies of Aaron out of it and keep moving forward. Let's go to the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek chapter 10, and let's just read verse 90. That's Melchizedek chapter 10 verse 90. It says, and on the day of new oil it shall be witnessed that Anokeesed has a desire to live with his children, and the men are to seek guidance as to how they can minister to the people, so they can know him, and they are to establish by their intervention a clear pathway to Eden. Now drop down to verse 92. I'm not going to get into 91 right now because I want to focus on what the men and the women need to do. And really, that section between there is something that you'll do in community. But look at verse 92. That's Melchizedek chapter 10, verse 92. It says, "And the women are to intervene with a firm foundation in virtue, in charity, and obedience to the Spirit of the Lord, and they are best to be guided in their association together by the meanings of the four directions of Anokeesed, and how he would reprove in his loving kindness. How does he want life to be lived? To include the sweet moments that are recorded in the book of life. What would Anokeesed do? To bring assurance to those who need to feel forgiven. And what vision is before the Father of heaven and earth that gives him hope?" Verse 93. "And if they do all these things and live the answers to those questions, those in their midst who have fallen prey to violence and acts of evil, who have repented before the Lord, can find peace in Mayim, and will be comforted and transformed, and be whole with his marvelous forgiveness." So you see that the women are to intervene with the four directions of Anokeesed, and they'll ask these questions: how he would reprove in his loving kindness, how does he want life to be lived, what would Anokeesed do, and what vision is before the Father of heaven and earth. So family, after the celebration of new oil, then our next holy day is another day of remembrance, and this one is the beginning of the winter. And so now let's go in the book of remembrance of Enoch, the Essene book of Haggai, to Bidal chapter 13, and let's read verses 145 through 151. That's Bidal 13, verses 145 through 151. It says, "And it came to pass that Matzah continued to instruct Enoch according to the division of days. And he told him that since the day that Yatsakad and Kavah sinned in Eden, and since they passed through the oaks of Pethach, they were not happy and content, and the heart of their father was moved with sorrow, and he wept. And Matzah came to them soon after their day of sorrow began, and he came to forgive them, and to instruct them in the way they should go. And he made them clothes, and he went with them, and he gave the elements of righteousness freely to them, and he healed them, and touched them to comfort them, but they still were unhappy. And in this way Matzah tried to prevent this sorrow, and he even slept with them to bring the comfort of a tender father, but they were unhappy still. And the sorrow of Anokeesed remained to linger in his heart, to burden him down, he being a tender parent who wants his children to be happy. So once again, the hero of all men intervened, and Matzah called upon the Urkadeshi to help him, and Shemael offered to help. And she spoke to Yatsakad and Kavah, and they together brought the living waters of understanding and happiness in rich forgiveness. And when Kavah heard that there would be a measure of grace for her little Kenna, she rose up in the dance, with her life restored to her, and her joy and happiness abounded, and Yatsakad was filled with the Spirit, and he praised Anokeesed in that day. And the richness of the Spirit of forgiveness flooded over them, and they became happy and content, and their souls held the living water. And it was the day of forgiveness, and it is the last holy day of the year, and it is a jubilee of days after the celebration of new oil. And a jubilee of days after the day of forgiveness is the last day of the year. And this is a day to celebrate the life-giving powers of forgiveness. And it is a day to teach and instill in the people the love of repentance, and a day to acknowledge the rightful place of Anokeesed in your lives. And it is a day to make gentle words of forgiveness to one another, and a day for men of Ishyad to set in motion the purifications of healing in relationships and families, and peace and reconciliation shall preside in the hearts of the righteous. And in a sabbatical year, it is the day of release. So family, this day of forgiveness, this day of forgiveness is what turned into the day of atonement. You see, they named it under Aaron the Day of Atonement. When you go back to the source, it was the day of forgiveness. Let's go to the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek, chapter 10, and let's read verses 94 through 97. That's the book of Remembrance of Melchizedek, chapter 10, verses 94 through 97. It says, "And on the day of forgiveness, the men are to establish or reaffirm with a firm intent the love of repentance, and to encounter reproval with humility and a wise comportment. And they are to teach throughout the year repentance that arises out of love for the Lord, that is joined to forgiveness. And on this day, the Urkadeshi will be waiting for their instruction in how to cover the people with his mantle of forgiveness, and they are to pray specific prayers for their loved ones in the Lord. And the women are to set in place during the preceding Jubilee of Days with deliberateness and intelligence and with gentleness the surety of a tried wall against pride. And the Urkadeshi have longed for the day for that wall to be built among the righteous, and they wait with anticipation for the women of Maim to accomplish this task for Anokeesed. And righteous women in community have been prepared by the Lord, and they are skilled to accomplish it. And Anokeesed will endow them with power as they enter in to keep those protections in place among the people. And it will grow in time to be a bulwark that is impenetrable by the tempter. And it will come here a little and there a little, year by year, as they show sin and error to be as they show sin and error to not be a crisis, but only normal with a strong showing of love in spite of sin. And the people will learn to feel the feelings that uphold forgiveness, and any accuser will be shut out. And the final blow to evil in the days of your year will be crowned with the rich mantle of forgiveness, and thus the last holy day of the year leads you to arrive back to reclaim your beginning on the day you give your life to the Lord with the measure of Miloo. Did y'all just read that? You mean to tell me that even when you look at the holy days in the year, the works of the Lord are one eternal round? Amazing. Absolutely amazing. So family, in your notes, what you should have as the list for these holy days, you should have first the days of remembrance and where you can find them. Then you should have that first day of remembrance, which runs concurrent with New Year's Day, which is the day of remembrance for the spring. Then you should have Miloo's Day. Then you should have the Day of Instruction or Shabuwa. Then you should have the Day of Remembrance that starts the summer. Then you should have the Feast of Tranquility or Passover. Then you should have the Feast of IKAR or the celebration of IKAR or First Fruits. Then you should have the Day of Remembrance that starts the fall. Then you should have the Day of Remembrance or the Day of Remembering Virtue. Then you should have the celebration of new oil. or the Feast of Dedication. Then you should have the Day of Remembrance that starts the winter. Then you have the final day, which is the Day of Forgiveness. And when you look at these days, remember, aside from the days that are the purification days, aside from the days that are the beginning of each season, aside from them, all of these days are a jubilee apart from each other. So you got 50 days, 50 days, 50 days, and 50 days over and over again like clockwork. So family, if you counted these days, this is 11 days out of 12 months. And this isn't even counting the other 2 times which we should keep because they are more traditions. But those days are talking about Ingathering and also Purim, which is found in Esther, because that is specific after that time. So when you look at that, when you add those 2 days, then you got 13 days. The point I'm making is the Father loves us so much that He gives us all of these wonderful times to celebrate and be festive and enjoy. 11 whole days out of the year. And you have 4 days, which are the days that are at the beginning of every season. And then you have the 7 holy days that are not those days, that are all 50 days apart. Look at that. So you got 7 and you got 4. Now, let's go to the book of Remembrance of Enoch, chapter 13, and let's go to Bedal. Bedal chapter 13, and let's read verses 155. Let's go ahead and read through 162. Verses 155 through 162. It says, "And there are 7 holy days, and the day of the new year. And for 2 days you shall sleep with him, at the new year and the day of tranquility. And for 2 days you shall eat with him, at the celebration of IKAR and the day of forgiveness. And for 2 days you shall walk with him, at the celebration of new oil and the day of the measure of Miloo. And for 2 days you shall labor with him, for the day of instruction and the day of remembering virtue. And you shall keep his pillow clean and sacred in all of your dwelling places. And you shall make dishes for him to eat on and to drink from, and they are also to be kept clean and sacred in your dwelling places. And on the day of remembering virtue, you shall labor all that day long, doing special labors of love for one another, and with Anokeesed. And all of the activities of this holy day shall be done the day before, so that on that day it will be only a day to labor in love for him and one another. And on the days you walk with him and you work with him, you are to speak to him aloud concerning your activities all throughout the day. Be not ashamed to hear one another, speaking to him aloud on these 2 days. And the very Father of heaven and earth will be at your side. And you will see that the holy days of your year begin by giving your lives to Matzah the Lamb. Then because of this, he can intervene to bless and comfort his Father together with you, and your year ends with the overflowing forces and blessings of rich forgiveness, only to begin one sacred cycle again. And these days will be spent in rich fellowship, and thus has the division of days now come to you, in the richness of the first great 70. Family, I pray that y'all were edified. I pray that you have an understanding of these ancient holy days. And family, I pray that you will continue to listen for his voice. Listen for that still small voice. With that said, family, do not forget that I love each and every one of you. The water, Kai. All praises to Anokeesed, Bahashem Matzah, the Lamb. This is little son Sabal saying much love and much shalom.